Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Cast Dice, the podcast that explores the great big wild world of tabletop gaming that exists today. It has been said one or two times, mainly on this podcast, that we are in the middle of a gaming renaissance. There are just too many good games out there that we can spend our hobby time and our hobby dollar on. It can be confusing on which way to, what game to play next and which way to turn. There are just too many good games out there. And I guess that's the purpose of this podcast, to explore the gaming industry as a whole, to talk about games that my guests and I have enjoyed playing, and to talk about gaming events that we have played in. Now, it is a rare treat to have a hobby hero on. I do like to have lots of some old friends on to talk about the games that we love, and in some cases we get to talk to the people who have written those games. And this man is, I'm proud to say, a regular now, friend of the cast, the man whose name graces quite a few titles on my shelf, and of course we're talking partial creator of Bolt Action. We're talking the author of Warlords of Erehwon, Gates of Antares, and of course Warhammer 40,000. There's only one man who I could be talking about. The man, the myth, the legend, the one and only Rick Priestley. Welcome back to Cast Dice.
Hiya, Brad. Well, that was quite a build-up. As per usual, I shall fail to live up to expectations.
Hardly, Rick, hardly. Oh, man. Well, we had so much feedback from the last time you were on that it was only natural that we invite you back after Cast Dice 2-year birthday. We had to have back one of our most popular guests. That would be your wonderful self.
Complaints, I assume.
Yeah,
we deluged with angry letters.
Hey, that's how this show usually runs, so I think we're all right there. You're in good company with me then, Rick. But look, I think it's timely because you have, and we'll get to the broader arc in a minute, but just to quickly tease what we'll be talking about later, you have continued to support Warlords of Erehwon after the game has come out, it being sort of a game that you sat down to write in I'm quoting you here, not me, in your quote-unquote retirement, a game you keep supporting and putting out new army lists for. I believe we're up to 7 new armies for the game that have been released through your website, and you gave away sort of the keys to the castle and gave out how you create your army list, as in the formula system. You've been a busy man. And
well, the points values I had to do anyway. I did that before the book was published, but right. I just tidied it up, took out all of the all of the kind of just hints. What I'd normally do is I'd construct a system, but pretty much shorthand, pencil on the back of a notepad sort of thing, and then type it up. But for somebody else to use it, it needed to be a little bit more explanatory, which I did.
Nice.
Yeah, that seems to have gone down well. Sometimes I'm very nervous about putting a points value system out there because all it does is it exposes all the mistakes you've made. Otherwise, might have gone unnoticed. And occasionally you make a jump. You go, this works out at, say, 10 points, but it really isn't worth 10 points for some reason. So you might go, it's going to be 9 or it's going to be 8. But of course, as soon as you put the points value system out there, all those little tweaks that you've kind of you've made on judgment, they suddenly become, oh, what is this one right? Is this one right? And you go, well, actually, it sort of is right. It's just I made a judgment. But there you go.
We'll leave it to nerds like us to look into games that we love and within minutes try and break the damn thing. As a game writer, I'm sure that's or as a game creator, I should say, that must be frustrating. I don't know. Is it humbling? Is it a compliment that everyone gets so excited about these damn things? I know some people take it personally. Having talked to you before, you don't seem to. What are your sort of thoughts on people really, nitpicking every little point value of a thing that you've spent so long creating?
I don't know. I mean, from day one when we produced the first version of Warhammer, it got slammed and poor reviews, and people saying, "Oh, this is just nonsense. It's buckets of dice, and it's simplistic. It's aimed at children." ... Yeah, you can, every single thing we've done at Games Workshop and then at all, it's people just find whatever it is, they'll find things to say, and I just don't worry about it. It's like you write the games for the people that enjoy them, and people that enjoy them are often quite critical or make points about things that they either personally would have done differently. But I always go, yeah, well, you weren't doing it, I was doing it. That's the decision I made.
Exactly.
And if you want to join in. If you want to change it, change it. I don't feel that these things are works of art in a high sense. I like to think they're carefully crafted, but ultimately my aim would be to create something that's more of a sandpit.
Nice. Yeah.
Than stone thing, an artifact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes me laugh to hear you say that when Warhammer came out that everyone said it was for children, given that, of course, Rogue Trader, which is the first edition of Warhammer 40,000, was by definition almost more of a role-playing game than it was a tabletop war game at times. And I very firmly or fondly remember, and I'm not even sure this was legal, but my friends and I were playing, and I had a psyker pick up a Land Raider and drop it on his general. And but the rules, I mean, were a little more complex than what we would consider a Warhammer game now. And to hear someone say that it's simplistic and for children, having been a child who played that game, it was infinitely more complex than what you would have today. So I think that says a lot about where maybe the gaming industry has gone.
Well, this was certainly true in the 70s and 80s, and probably later, even probably true today. But most adults really underestimate what teenagers, I say teenagers rather than children, because to my mind, somebody who's 14, 15, 16 isn't really a child.
Right.
And even a bit younger than that, anyone older than about 11, really, they're incredibly focused and can absorb information like a sponge in ways in which adults find perplexing. I mean, I'm talking, mature, particularly middle-aged people, find utterly perplexing. And the number of times we would be speaking as a management team to city bankers, financiers, high-flying, very intelligent, often Cambridge, Oxford University educated people who looked at our stuff and were just baffled by it. And their premise was that, you have to make it simpler for children. I know if they're trying to give us advice, it would be, you need to make this simpler so children are going to understand it. And I go, no, actually, you don't get it. It's you that doesn't understand it.
Right.
But children, i.e. teenagers, they don't even blink. They absolutely throw themselves into it. They absorb it like a sponge. They have far better understanding of how this game works and it's structured than all these so-called grown-ups.
It's true.
Who are dealing with millions of pounds and making decisions that affect our lives. And it's just the way it is. And I think one of the great advantages that we had is we didn't actually underestimate the 14-year-olds, because, and I say 14 because that was sort of where we tended to find our game. When I'm talking about Games Workshop, that's where we tended to find our median age range customer was. But I always wrote games for my younger self, so I knew they would appeal to my older self and to older players too. But I had my younger self in mind when I wrote them, and I think that it comes across. But it comes across in terms of explanation, because I do remember picking up games and being baffled by them.
Yes,
because they were never explained very well. I'm really going back. This is like the 70s. I remember the first set of WRG ancient rules we picked up, which would be second or third edition, and just being utterly baffled by how the units set up and moved, because it wasn't really explained. It was just taken as read that you knew how to play.
Exactly.
And there you go. A lot of early games rules like that.
I see, and please excuse me if I've made this joke before when you were on, Rick, but I want to say I might have, but I was my best friend growing up wasn't allowed to interact with comic books or regular commercial television, and so he was very limited at what he was allowed to do. His parents wanted him to be a good young man, and of course, that didn't always work out for him. As in what he grew into. However, but he was allowed one television show, and it was Star Trek, and so. Because he did, I learned, and he was interested in the games that I was playing. So I went out as a kid and bought Starfleet Battles, and I read it, and I reread it, and I read it again. And even as a kid, when I would just devour rule sets, I basically grew up reading these things. I still don't get that game. And I swear I still maintain you need some sort of community college course to be able to have played that rule set. And it was just brutal. Old school rule sets were not player friendly. I think the first game I picked up that was possibly BattleTech. But I mean, even Car Wars was more of a car combat simulator than it was, for example, an actual fun game. And I love that game. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I think, back in the 70s in particular, because computers weren't a thing, they didn't exist except in big office buildings where they were the size of fridges. Mm-hmm. There was a huge sort of cult for simulation wargaming where you did a lot of calculation. The sort of thing that a computer would do just so easily these days. Right. And I think that style of wargaming has turned into video gaming, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the video games of today, of course, I think it's less of a mathematical simulation and more of a visual one. But yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very good point. It's a very good point. Well, all right, let's talk a little bit about the last time you were on. Now, the last year you were on, we talked a little bit about your last years at Games Workshop. We talked about the death of Warhammer and what that looked like before the current plan that turned into Age of Sigmar. And a lot of people said they really liked that story. Now, I've been to games days with you. I've been to some after parties around you. I'm sure there are some great anecdotes out there. Anything spring to mind as a good anecdote for a Rick Priestley, uniquely Rick experience that might be fun for listeners to hear?
Well, I don't know. There's so many things, Brad, but I don't know whether it'd be interesting or not. I do remember very early on when we first moved to our factory at Eastwood, and we had quite a bit. It was quite big compared to the factory we'd had previously, which was an old Victorian sweatshop, really. Mm-hmm. And this was a brand new factory, and it had two 10,000 square foot warehouses, one of which we were using, and one of which we knew we'd expand into. Mm-hmm. When we moved in, it was empty, so we decided to have a kind of a games day equivalent.
Nice!
This big open warehouse, in this factory at Eastwood, and we did, and we set up tables and everything, and invited people. And we got quite a few people coming in. It was on ticket, I think. Mm-hmm. And I was running a Bring and Battle for Warhammer, and I'd not really prepared anything. You can't really for Bring and Battle. People just bring their units,
right,
and they fight. So all you do is kind of umpire it or try to. And I turned up, and there was going to be two. I was going to be umpiring it, and there were two of our guys were going to be like the chief commanders to the other side, and and one of them was Gary Chalk, who worked for us. Mm-hmm. And I turned up, and I think we'd been celebrating the night before. Mm-hmm. I don't know what. Celebrating the pub's opening.
Yes.
But
that day.
I was pretty hungover. I was a bit out of it. I turned up, whatever. And people would turn up with their games, with their units. And I'd pretty much be okay. That's a unit of Dark Elves. That's fine. I can cope with that. That's a unit of Goblins. That's it. And he started fighting. It was all very amiable. And this young kid turns up with a Balrog. And I looked at this thing and I thought, I can't. Yeah, okay, just put it on. Yeah, be fine.
Yeah.
And this kid had obviously gone through. I mean, he was a kid too. He was like he was 12, let's say. So you didn't want to be rude, or you didn't want to be unaccommodating and going, "Oh, bless him," sort of thing. Put him there, he'll be fine. The others will look after him. And he totally he'd got everything off pat, including all of the spells and everything. And he just proceeded to sort of like destroy everything on the table, and everyone else was getting a bit pissed off with this, as you can imagine. And I'm just going, and I'm there. Oh yeah, I don't know. I was just not. I was just not quite there. And in the end, we had to kind of abandon the game. And Gary was getting increasingly pissed off with this whole thing. So what I thought would be a sort of like poor little lad, he doesn't know he's bought a Balrog, just turned out to be a complete mess.
Yeah.
And there you go. And that just shows you what kids do know.
Yes, right? And we used to have a trophy for that at some of the 40K events, where that nice little kid shows up, or that, innocent, fresh-faced gamer, and then, they smash through everything in their path, and you gave them the Bloodthirster award because there was literally nothing stopping them, and they just truck through everything, and you go, oh, I didn't see that coming. I think
this one was to be encouraged.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe next time you should take a goblin. All right, buddy? Sit down. Yeah, no, man. Oh, definitely been there. All right, Rick. A lot of people ask, and these are the questions that people do ask. When the authors write these games, what is their army? Now, I know when we first spoke, way back when on the Warlord cast, when Warlords of Erehwon was just coming out, and you had been spending a lot of time working on your gnolls, and it's why the gnoll army list is in the book. Are you still playing gnolls? Yes. Are there other armies that you've been dabbling with, especially now that the new ones are out?
Yeah, I've just had some more lizard men painted up.
Nice.
So I can broaden what I've got for that. It's a little bit basic at the moment. I've not done a lot more with my gnolls. I've got a playable warband together, and my ambition was to add some chariots to it, and I've just not got the main one I tend to use for Erehwon is really barbarians.
Oh, really?
Which are because I've got so many Celts in particular.
Of course.
And I don't know if you know, but years and years and years ago, I actually made some Celts, which were released for a short while by Wargames Foundry.
Really?
They're not really up to modern. They weren't even up to modern standards at the time, but I think they did them as a bit of a favour.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got quite a lot of those, which I quite enjoy using.
Now, when you say you had those made, did you make them, or did you commission someone to sculpt them up for you?
I sculpted them. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're.
Are there pictures of these somewhere? Well, Rick, come on. If Rick Priestley sculpts a range, I mean, one must see these somewhere. Are they on? I'm assuming they're on the all-knowing, all-seeing internet somewhere, or is this one of those things that we're going to have to pry pictures out of you and share it through the Facebook page?
Yeah, you might have to. I could photograph. It's not a huge. I haven't got a huge amount, but I could photograph them and put them onto Facebook. People would laugh at them.
I doubt that. I mean, that's great. I mean, you sculpted. Has someone who's sculpted some very mediocre models myself. I'm sure you've done a better job. And when you say you sculpted a range's worth, how many? Because that requires a lot of individual work. Did you do like a core group and cast them out into larger numbers? Tell us about this.
Yeah, basic tech. Bear in mind, I used to make 15mm figures. I used to make 15mm figures for tabletop games.
I didn't know that.
Before I joined Games Workshop. Yeah, I sculpted quite a few. I did their Norman, Saxon and Saxon range, Pony Wars range.
Mm-hmm.
I did a Colonial Zulu range, and some ancients. I did Seleucid. What else I did? Yeah, that. So and those are, when I say a range, I mean they were quite big ranges, about a dozen figures per range or more. So I'd already sculpted quite a bit, so I wasn't like starting afresh.
Right.
And before that, before I went to college, I did a few pieces for Asgard. But that, it was back in the day when the bar was very low, and I should emphasize this. and I was sculpting in milliput. Green stuff didn't come out, and well, we didn't find it in England until early 80s. When I joined Games Workshop, which was 1982, the Perrys was still sculpting in milliput, and Tom Meyer from Ralpatha, he came over because we had a kind of a deal going with Ralpatha where we produced Ralpatha figures in the UK, and Ralpatha produced Citadel figures in the US.
I remember that. Yeah.
So and as part of that sort of deal, and I suspect because he was interested in travel, Tom came over to the UK and he stayed with Brian or various people. I briefly had him as a lodger, but only the fact that my house was such a dump, I think he more or less decided to give up on it.
Right on.
But he introduced green stuff to the UK. So before that, we all sculpted in milliput. And what I would do is it's just basic technique, really. You make a wire armature, as you'd expect. You know, I mean, I'm sure most people have seen these processes. You make a wire armature and you build up a basic body. And usually what you do is you build up a body in a pose and then another body in another pose. And you'd leave off things like the hands. Right. So you just have little wires sticking out for the hands. And you'd usually leave out the head. And you'd leave off any weapons and extra detail. So you basically just got a figure in. If it's a Celt, which mine was, you've just got a figure in trousers and a tunic. And you cast that into tin. So you've now got a basic dolly, right? And then you individually dress it, animate it, which you just do by cutting behind the legs and reposing, or cutting at the arms and reposing. Sometimes you just cut a whole arm off and repose it, because if you want a figure that's actually striking overhead, it's not just the arm that moves; it's the whole shoulder girdle. Right. You know, and this is the mistake people make with plastic figures. You know, you look like an action man. Yes. Because there's no movement in the spine, or you know what I mean? They're just like very sort of, I hate that. So, you know, a figure really, if you stand in front of a mirror and just sort of pretend you're striking overhead, you see your whole body adjusts to that. So sometimes, you know, you have to make a specific, but you can do that. Anyway, you put a head on, you put the weapons on, you make a figure, and then you make that into a master, and then you make a mold. So you might have, from an original piece, or 2 or 3 original pieces, you might have a dozen or 2 dozen different figures. And then when they come back from the master molding process, you can cut a head off and put a different helmet on, and so on. You know, you make a variety. And I made it wasn't very many, because I essentially wanted them for myself. So probably about a dozen different infantry. There were 3 different cavalry. I made a horse, which is tricky.
I was going to say, horses are awful. Yeah. I've actually tried that. Yeah, that's terrible. Painting horses is bad enough. Sculpting horses is insane.
Do you know what I think I did? I'm ashamed to admit it, but a lot of sculptors, especially in the early days, did this. Is I found a horse I liked that somebody else had done. I think it was a Perry one. It was a Citadel one. And you carve it all down. So you're only left with a skeleton, like a frame, and then you build it back up. So essentially, you're using somebody else's model as a dolly, but you're saving yourself having to make an armature.
But that's a fairly common practice, though, with a lot of sculptors, isn't it? I mean, that's not stealing. That's common practice. I mean, that's if you find something that works, as you say, you shave it down and then you make it your own. That I've been seeing those for years. When you look at somebody's greens and you go, can you do that? Because I can see bits and pieces of the model that you had underneath, and that is not yours.
Yeah, people have done that for years. It depends to some extent. I mean, I really did shave it down to make a thing. But also, we're talking about the same company. The model belonged to the company that I was doing it for, so it wasn't too much of an issue. Right. In all the 15 mil figures I did for tabletop, I used their standard horse. So I didn't actually make the horse, although I did sometimes modify it.
Right.
But that's fairly common. And in fact, I made a whole series of weapons for that were then used by other people, because I was quite a good straight line designer.
Nice.
And I was quite good at making, shields and swords and axes and things like that. Yeah, I did that. And
I had no idea you were so talented, Reg.
Wait until you see them, Brad. I made a chariot as well. And then what I did was when I got them back as castings, I then modified them again. So a lot of the figures I've got, because I wanted them all to be different.
Right.
So a lot of the figures I've got are actually individual conversions of models, where I'd gone back and put on sort of headdresses and things. And there's a sorceress as well. I did a female dolly, and it's a basic female figure, and made a sorceress and a kind of female warrior, just one, but as a character.
That's fantastic. Oh, mate, I have to see pictures of these. I mean, that is a true labor of love. That is a project that you brought to creation from nothing. Even if you did, I mean, maybe carve back someone's horse. I mean, to be able to say that you created something that did not exist, and then you did it, and then you painted it, is, I mean, that's pretty special.
A lot of people do it these days. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I see on the internet a lot of amateur sculptors who I look at and I go, if you'd been about in the 1970s, you would have been the world's best sculptor. Yeah. And this is something, and they've just gone, I'm not sure about this. What do you think? I don't know why they're showing everyone else, but and I'm looking at it and thinking, that's not, for somebody who's not sculpted professionally and not sculpted, but they've perhaps just messed around a bit. These are pretty good. There are lots of very good tutorials online, and we were all learning from each other. I'd say that compared to, say, the 1980s and 90s, when I was trying to recruit sculptors for Games Workshop, there are now so many talented sculptors about. There really are. And we pretty much hoovered up all the pool of sculptors in the UK in the 90s.
Yeah,
I mean, there were about doesn't.
Well, this is something that, I mean, we've talked about on this podcast a little bit, is it seems as though maybe it's something, a side effect of the information age, where we're all connecting more regularly and we are finding information, we're sharing, experiences, and the gaming industry has been around as long as it has. All of a sudden we have our shared sort of collective experience when it comes to game writing in particular, sort of has raised all boats. All games seem to be pretty damn good this day and age in order to survive. But I mean, that goes the same for painting, and that goes the same for sculpting. I mean, if you look back at old White Dwarves or old Dragon magazines, and you look at the quality of the painting and you compare it to what is considered basic tabletop standard. I mean, technology as far as paints, brushes, washes, all of that has advanced so far. And not to say that the olden days weren't great. I absolutely, I long for a simpler time sometimes. However, I mean, just the level of quality, especially in the last 10, 15 years, has been astonishing. Do you find that? I mean, you've been along this road a lot longer than me, and I feel like I've been on it for a long time. What are your feelings on that?
No, I think you're right there, Brad. It's everything has suddenly become almost professional level from even ordinary hobbyists. You can't tell how long they're spending on these things. Sometimes I suspect that it's a time issue. When we were trying to make a living at this in the 70s and 80s, I mean, let's go back to when I first started, and I was talking to Brian Ansell, who was at Asgard Miniatures at the time, 1977, 76 maybe, no, 77, 78. And Brian showed me basically how he made a miniature, because I painted a little bit for Asgard, and he said, well, if you can paint, you can probably sculpt. I thought, well, I've always wanted to sort of mess around with that sort of thing. I've always been intrigued by the process. And he said, well, this is how I do it. And he showed me how he made a figure. He was using wax.
Wow.
He he was using wax to start with, but later he moved on to milliput and stuff. But he just showed me how he made the figure, how he made the mold, how he cast a basic dolly, and then he cut down the details into the metal. And I think he developed his technique a lot after that, but that was how he started. So Brian encouraged me, and I went home and I had a go. And he basically looked at the first figure I'd done and said, "Well, that's not bad, you know. I think we can produce that. I just need to make." And the first things I did actually got produced by Asgard, so the standard was quite low. Whereas these days you can never get away with that. But the models that Asgard were making, basically to earn a living, the story was, if you want to make a living as a sculptor, or you want to be involved in this industry, even if you want to sculpt to make a decent living at it, you have to make a figure a day.
Yes, so I've heard that.
From scratch.
Yeah.
One figure a day from scratch. So let's say 5 figures. Truth was you worked all hours, but let's say 5-6 figures a week. That would give you a basic living, not a lot of money, but a basic living. 15 mil figures, you had to make 3 a day.
Yeah.
So, and when you had to make 3 of something a day from scratch, sometimes you got to dress the dollies, so that was quicker. But the originals 3 a day. But you had to make 3 figures a day. You learn fast when you go fast.
Yes, that's right.
You learn slowly if you go slowly. And I think a lot of people stumble when they're trying to learn how to sculpt, because they try to sculpt something that's perfect.
Yeah.
And the best advice Brian ever said to me was, make 20 figures, throw them away, and bring me your 21st.
Yeah.
Because you learn, in your first 20 figures, you'll learn pretty much everything you need to know. And you'll learn so much from doing one that your second one will be twice as good, and your third one will be 3 times, and so on, until you actually get about 20. You don't know how good you are. So I was quite lucky in a way that actually my first one got made. But
yeah,
it probably took me a little bit longer than a day.
Yeah,
but that was his advice, and it's advice that I try to pass on. I wouldn't be so brutal as to say do 20, but whatever you do, if it's your first model, you'll be justifiably proud of it. But by the time you've made 5, look back, and I think that's as true today as it was then. If you're quite proud of your first one, it's good. Just think how good you're going to be 5 more.
Exactly, right?
And that's what to do. Yeah.
All right, Rick. Let's rein. I think we're going down many a rabbit hole, and God, I'm enjoying it. But let's get back to Warlords of Erehwon for a second. Let's talk point values, because we started there, and then we took a hard left and then a hard right, and I'm not sure what rabbit hole we fell into. Point values. Now, I love this system, and I mentioned the last time you were on that I had tried to deconstruct your points to create, Rogue Trader-esque Warhammer 40K, like the original Rogue Trader Space Marines and the original like generic Space Orcs army list for this game. And then I looked back at what I'd deconstructed from what you'd done, and what you actually did. And though I was very close, all of a sudden my desire to retcon a whole lot of old armies when I had the actual keys in front of me, sort of disappeared. But there are a lot of really cool models that I have in my cupboard fantasy models that I want to pull back out. But when I was retconning, just to bring this full circle, I started with a generic stat from particular armies. So when I was doing the Space Orcs, I went back to the generic Orcs. And then I sort of pulled apart some of the additional abilities by comparing army lists and tried to figure out what actual stats caused. But it just like with your sculpting, where you started with the dolly, I always sort of stripped it back to a base profile and tried to work off of there. And looking at the way that you've done your own point system, that looks very similar to what you've done. Now, that, of course, is
Yeah.
reading your notes, not actually what you did. Is that kind of how you operated when you built this system?
Yeah, it's exactly the same as when I did the system for the original Warhammer and 40K as well.
So talk to us a little bit about how
which
that
actually
works.
was published.
Oh, wait, was it? Wait,
it was published in Forces of Fantasy, I think. It's very early Warhammer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's and it's basically exactly the same as I've done really for Erehwon. I mean, the trick is usually I go take a human, because a human is going to be a base stat. You can argue about what an orc's like, or even a dwarf or a goblin, but you can't argue about what a human's like.
Right.
And most things are going to be either tougher than humans, stronger, taller, whatever, or they're going to be a bit weedy. Especially if you're thinking Lord of the Rings, goblins, whatever. You're going to be a little bit weedy. So a human is a reasonably good place to start. You need some space below and you need some space above in terms of the points values and abilities in the game. I usually start off with a human is 5 points, and I think I did that in Warhammer as well. Because 5 points is enough to give you again a little bit of space. Yeah. So, a goblin can be 3 or 4, and you're not getting to the point whereby your 1 point increments are too give you too much,
right? Because
you want that for weapons and upgrades and things like that. So, I generally start at 5, and then the stat line for Erehwon. Again, it's not dissimilar to a stat line I'd do for Warhammer or role-playing game or whatever. It's agility, accuracy, strength,
resilience,
the resist, if you like, and initiative and command. And they're all D10 stats. So a 5 is a basic 50% chance.
Right.
In Warhammer, a 3 was a 50% chance.
That's right.
Because it's 3. Generally speaking, it was 3 and 6. It wasn't the same sort of system. It didn't necessarily have values worked out in that same way, but it was generally 3. So 3s for Warhammer would generally give you a average.
Right.
Over time, stat inflation tended to push that. That's mostly because we found it's very difficult to sell something that was below average. So it's one of those terrible things where I go, I don't care about that as a games designer. If my goblin is going to be below average, live with it.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that you couldn't make it and sell it for less the problem. Which incidentally is why the Skaven army became what it was, rather than what it has. We'll come back.
Really?
And then you have your initiative and command stats, which are what's Skaven? Yeah, we'll come back to that.
Yes, please do.
I think we're going to talk about the Ratter army.
Yes, we are. Yeah.
But you have your initiative and command stats, which are the ones you use to get units moving in Erehwon, and they're based on 7, so you got a 70% chance of getting something moving.
Right.
Well, in Warhammer, they were also based on 7s, but with a 2d6, which is
right.
which if you go 7 or less on a d10, that's roughly. If I think I'm not quite sure what it is off the top of my head, but it's 60% chance. It's more likely than not to happen. So they're actually comparable in terms of what they're doing in the game system. They're just rigged for a different kind of mechanic. So my base values for my human stats are all 5s with the initiative and command set at 7s. And that's an average stat, and I give that 5 points. And after that, you up a stat or reduce a stat, and you just add or reduce the points value. And generally, some stats are worth a little bit more than others. And usually, your stats that are protective, the chance of you getting killed stat, is worth more than your chance of moving or your move-based stat.
Right.
And your chance of hitting something or striking or causing damage in combat is worth more than your chance of doing that at range, because range attacks are usually a little bit less effective.
Right.
the things which are going to win you the game are getting into combat and surviving. So those are the things which cost you more points. And I generally, in Erehwon, I just doubled it. So each pip of strength, which is your core chance of hitting, is 2 points, whereas your agility, which is your chance of making a move or surviving or not taking a pin when you run, things like that, they're 1 point. Right. And similarly, for command and initiative's chance of making a reaction, not that important. You can do without that, 1 point. But your basic command, which is your chance of making a move at all, especially once you've got pins, 2 points. And I just did that, and that seemed to work fine.
Yeah,
it falls apart slightly with very, very low values, where they reduce down to 0 quite quickly. Okay. And it falls apart at higher values, where some of the things, chariots in particular, didn't quite mesh, and that's mostly because the value in chariots is not in the stat line so much as in the amount of damage you can do on impacts and things like that. But that's it. That's it really. And then you add on for weaponry. Armor adds on automatically because it adds on to res.
Right.
And that's it. It's not it's a fairly basic way of doing working out base points values, and that's how I do everything. Not terribly sophisticated. Some special abilities add on per model. But other special abilities are only really relevant to a unit, so they add on per unit.
Right.
And so on. On the whole, I tend to make special abilities relatively expensive because I tend to think the gamers are very good at extracting value from things, better than me often. And it's better to err on the side of them being more expensive. And if people say, "Oh no, these aren't worth that," and I go, "Fine, don't use it."
Yeah, exactly.
An army on the whole shouldn't be all elite troops.
Right.
If you make them all elite troops because it's worth it, it's slightly wrong.
Yeah, everyone will.
Everyone will. Everyone's an elite then. You go, well, actually, if you can only afford to give 1 or 2 units that elite, maybe it's not worth it. But I'll tell you what, when you play, that elite unit will become the unit that wins the game because you'll use it properly.
Exactly.
Where everything's an elite, you just throw everything in. So I tend to be a little bit wary of criticism that goes, "These aren't worth this." Right. But occasionally you make the mistake that's the other way around. You make something too cheap because you haven't spotted a combination usually, or a combination in a particular army or force. And when that happens, people just pile into it.
That's
no
right.
one goes, "Well, I won't use it because it's a bit too good." They're not that way inclined.
No, usually they're not. So that's why, for example, in most of the army lists, there's one elite unit, and it has the stipulation that you can, if I can read this, include a maximum of 1 ... guards in your warband. It's to prevent people from taking all the quote-unquote best thing.
Yeah, it's to make them special.
Yeah, exactly.
And it gives the army a character. I used to do Warhammer armies the same way. The thing about Warhammer is, and 40Ks, as they developed, they became far more geared towards what people in the shops wanted to sell, rather than the games. Yeah. And some of the limits got taken off because there was a feeling that, well, you can only have 20 of these in an army or 10 of these in an army. So, and people want more, and we could sell more.
Yeah.
So you can see what would happen. The pressure would come on. Now, I always resisted that. I always made the case that the game had to have integrity. Yeah. But once I stepped away from running the studio and I stepped away from doing the games design, I had less influence on the process. Yeah. And to some extent, I felt that other people should be making those decisions, and it was, the baton had been passed on. You can't snipe from the back row.
No, exactly.
Occasionally something would be so terrible you felt obliged, but on the whole you can't. You have to let people do their own thing. Yeah. And I felt that that's what happened. It got some of the things that I've regarded as being, I don't know, what would you say, almost like keystones in the games design. became compromised, and that's one of them. It's the limiting things by type to create what I regard as a credible force.
Right.
I've not played Age of Sigmar, and I don't know how it's worked, but I gather that it's quite an open system.
It
perhaps
is.
you could tell me.
I have not actually played more than a couple of little practice experiences, and I struggle making armies with what I have. I find it to be one of the most, on one hand, very open, and a lot of the army lists are inclusive of a lot of units from what might be considered a lot of armies in the olden days. But it's also incredibly frustrating and limiting and in really bizarre ways. And I keep like trying to put an army on the table and realizing I'm several units short when I have figure cases of models from those particular ranges and go, how am I short? I have all of these fours. Anyway. Yes, Age of Sigmar.
Yeah. Well, because Erehwon is designed to facilitate the collections you've got. So ideally, you should be able to put together some sort of force.
Mm-hmm. And I have many, and it's one of my favorite games because of it. If I may, I am going to jump from army creation to specifically some of the armies I'm very excited about. Now, of course, the last time you were on, you teased... why am I blanking now? You teased the Samurai, of course, which came out. And Snakemen.
Okay.
And so Samurai and Snakemen came out, and you at the same time sort of updated all of the army lists that appeared in the book through your website. So you updated unit entries, you changed and modified some of the weapon options and some of the for some of the units, and some of the point values changed as people play tested the game, and as you found little things that may have needed fixing, or things you wanted to just modify for taste. But then you added several more army lists. So I guess the first big one since all of that was the redone reptiles, which should be said, it's not a redo, I should say, because it is not the Snake Man list that a lot of people said, oh, Rick has put out a Snake Man list. This must be a lizard person list. Well, now there's an actual reptiles list, which sort of is more encompassing of, some of the more generic, more commonly available lizard reptile-esque humanoid models on the market.
Yeah, well, when I do all the lists, I kind of bearing in mind the collections that people I know and me have, which tend to be Games Workshop, which tend to be Warhammer.
Right.
But there are other companies that have kind of piled in and produced Me Too ranges to some extent that replicate that. And other people have done ranges which are more in a different fantasy tradition. But Samurai, for example, I don't think Games Workshop do. We did years and years ago do a Samurai range, but certainly it's not part of the Warhammer game and hasn't been for years. So to some extent, there's going to be a Warhammer equality, and not least because I am involved in it. But I didn't want to, when I did the book, I didn't want to do anything that actually just paralleled or copied Games Workshop. I felt that was inappropriate. And so the armies that are in there are classic fantasy armies, some of which are very much the sort of thing that Games Workshop also do. Absolutely. Like, your elves and your I call it a knights list, but it's a medieval list, which is similar to the Empire and Bretonia. I didn't include a Ratman list or a Lizardman list, primarily because I don't have those armies, and I didn't know anyone who did. So they weren't really part of the whole Erehwon, putting Erehwon together. Right. But also because it's hard to do a Ratman list without referencing Skaven. Yes. I know Ratmen are something that's common to D&D and various other games, but really I know what people have got as Skaven armies. And similarly, I know in terms of Lizardmen, it's going to be Slann and Lizardmen and Skinks. Yeah. and there are some Me Too ranges out there which are similar, but which use the ideas. Uh, but I didn't want to get too close to it.
Right.
So what I did with um, the first one I did, a Snake Man, I think, that was actually Nick Eyre, who collared me one day in the car park and said, "How about we just do a list for my he did a plastic set to go with his
He did.
I can't remember what it's called.
Frostgrave.
Something Archipelago.
Ghost.
Yeah, it's a Frostgrave. There's
Yeah.
a supplement.
Yeah.
Ghost Archipelago.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah. And he'd done a range for that, and which I liked. It's got some nice stuff in it. And I had already bought and put together a few of the snake men, which to me are lizard men. You know, I mean, look at them and I go, well, lizard men to me, I suppose they're snaky, but they've got legs. So I just went. I said, yeah, I can do that. So I put a little list together, just used all the models in his range, and that was quite fun. And of course, people said, oh, can you add all these other things? Either traditional lizard men, or they're often specific to the Games Workshop version, where you have the small and the skinks and the lizard men. So I thought, well, I'll have a think about it and see what I can do. And I've sort of done my best without necessarily treading on the IP. I didn't want to do that.
Right.
But the minute you go, there's going to be a bigger, more fighty one, a smaller, more sort of running about and throwing things one. You've immediately got an orc and goblin dynamic.
Yes.
That was why we did it in back in the day at Games Workshop. It was to create that dual dynamic. But it actually is quite nice. It's quite a nice little list. It's got some interesting stuff in it. And I think if you've got a Games Workshop Lizardman army, or indeed models from any of the other companies that make similar things, you should be able to put an army together. Yeah. Eureka Miniatures do some fantastic things, which I always meant to get, but of course they're based in New Zealand, which makes you a little bit nervous about
shipping,
ordering from the UK. But my mate Nick has just started Eureka UK. So I'm hoping when he's settled, I shall be able to get in touch and have an army of him. And they make these they're almost like little turtle men, like Shalonians. Yes. And there's have you seen them?
Oh yes, and there's a giant turtle that you can ride on. That you have little turtle men riding on the back of. Right? So good. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So when I did the list, I had that half in mind.
Nice. Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, that'd be cool, I think.
Definitely.
And there's some nice dinosaur models too. Yeah. I know some of the wargames companies make dinosaur models, but you go into a toy shop and there are some fantastic dinosaur models.
There are great ones, right?
Yeah.
Going back to your story about the Balrog, nothing like a little kid looking at a dinosaur toy saying that that's not authentic enough to make a toy company want to make a better dinosaur. As a primary school teacher, let me tell you, kids have opinions about their dinosaur toys and they love to share them. So, I mean, you can see why
I'll tell you what as well.
Yeah, exactly. And and tell you every little feature about them. And if you're going to try and tell me that kids can't learn that sort of thing, oh, yes, they can. They do love a technical term.
Well, do you know, I was obsessed by dinosaurs when I was a kid. And I've still, the oldest book I own is a book about dinosaurs that was given to me by my auntie in 1966 for Christmas.
Wow. Nice. Nice. All right. Well, I got to ask, Rick. I'm sorry. We're skating around it, and now we're going to plunge right into my favorite army that you've done recently. And, of course, that's the rats. Let's talk dirty rats. So, Ratmen, as you say, it's hard to talk Ratmen without talking Skaven. Because at least, as you say, there are alternative, a lot of, as you would put it, Me Too lizard lists out there. And there are some great rat models, especially recently, as the market on GW models has gone through the roof. There are more and more third-party rat alternatives. But I was very pleased as a Skaven player who wasn't interested in necessarily playing Skaven and other game systems to open this list and go, I have that, I have that, I have that, I have that. And it was just a wonderful tick box experience for me. And because as a Skaven player, you end up with 10,000 rats, different Skaven in different shapes, size, colors, to all of a sudden have an army list that is so incredibly inclusive. And it was my experience when I first opened the Warlords of Erehwon book was I opened the Barbarian list and went, yes, I can take my entire Warriors of Chaos army. Yes, my Orc and Goblin army works for 2 separate army lists. This is fantastic. But I don't think any list was more inclusive of my collection than the Ratters list that just came out. You put a lot of work in that list, clearly, to have it be so inclusive, but also have it not directly step on GW's IP. It has its own personality. Do you want to talk about that process? Because that couldn't have been easy.
Yeah. You're right. The process was I started, and once you get going, you get into a mindset. So I thought, well, I've got to include basics. To me, a Ratman army is a horde army. And I think that's how it started out at Games Workshop as well. The idea is the idea of rats coming out in these vast numbers and living amongst decay and destruction. I think that's solid. So I started off with that, your basic core rats, and them being almost dispensable as individuals. And scatty, cowardly as individuals, like a rat on its own but en masse being that dangerous Nori thing. So I think that core character is Skaven have it, but I think it's core to the concept of a Ratman.
Agreed.
And so you start off with that. You go, well, that means you've got your core unit type. And what sort of weapons have they got? Well, they've basically got these swords and spears. There's nothing very exotic in that. It's what you'd expect. And they're not great fighters. They're scruffy, whatever, and they're not very brave. So I started off by giving them a leader. And there's you've got your warlord, you've got your hero, and you've got your wizard type character in all Erehwon army lists. That's just standard. So I did those. And then started working through some of the specifics. And as I was doing it, I kind of realized that it didn't quite fit a standard Erehwon army, because you can't. I wanted to make them cowardly, so low command values. But at the same time, they were becoming too fragile. In the same way in which goblins are very fragile.
Yes.
The goblins being fragile is okay. I just didn't want to create a furry goblin.
Yes.
You couldn't use the goblin list for Skaven or for Ratman if you wanted. It would work.
I thought about it.
I felt, no, it would work, but I think you'd just end up with furry goblins. And I thought the character of the rats is slightly different. So as I was filling out the army list types, you need your guard type. Well, I think Skaven, is it black rat? There's several types in Skaven, if I remember right. But I didn't want them to be too powerful, so they've got the usual kind of just step up in terms of their equipment and their stats. And the idea of having slaves Skaven or skates, that seemed to be transferable as well. So I created that underclass of really nasty rats. And you want the ones which are mutated or plagued up. So I did that. And I think there are several unit types in the Skaven list which would transfer over and you could use. And I kind of did a few hints. That's why I made the plague ratters they don't have a weapon attack. They have a standard attack. 2 attacks, in fact. They're rather good.
That's right.
If I remember right.
Yes, they are very good.
Yeah, they are actually quite a good unit, but they don't have a weapon.
No.
Because I knew there were lots of models available where they've got these rather plague-ridden looking rats that you could just incorporate into that unit, and it doesn't matter what they're armed with particularly, or even if they're armed at all.
Exactly.
I thought it's quite a nice image, so I took that over. But once I'd started to fill it out, it struck me that I needed to rework the rule for command, and the standard the standard command rule that you give the warlord doesn't quite work in. I wanted something where the command values were much more important and transferable, so I could reduce the command values of the troops a bit more. And so I created that pack and packmaster rule, where if your pack unit, and almost all the ratters are packs, if your pack unit is within 10 inches of a packmaster, then you don't just test on the packmaster's command. Your command counts as the packmaster's value. So for all purposes, and that includes, of course, for automatic brakes.
That's right.
So it keeps you up. And that works pretty well.
Yeah, and it makes
in retrospect. Yeah, it does. It makes the army unique, which is something I was looking for. Because there are so many iterations of army type. I always say there are 6. Once you've done 6, the fast, flighty, shooty one, the really solid, slow moving one. Once you've done 6, you've covered most of the bases.
Yeah.
So finding a different angle is quite tricky. But I thought that was good. It makes ratters distinct.
It does.
And then it does. And I managed to include some of the. I didn't give them a chariot, but I gave them that sort of
the cart.
Kind of like a mine wagon, a cart. Yeah. And I can imagine that in various ways. And if you've got something like a doom wheel, well, that would do.
Exactly.
But if you wanted to. Yeah, but I had something more in mind that was like a mine cart with a little bell on the front that the guy was ringing as it was being pushed down a mine shaft and into the enemy, probably dwarfs at the bottom.
Yes, exactly.
Something like in I was thinking Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. That scene. So something like that. But otherwise, I think it's it's a nice list. I enjoyed putting it together. I had to think about it a bit.
Yeah, and it's a very in the best way possible. It really encompasses what I love about sort of what I loved about playing Skaven, or it's vicious. It can deal out a lot of damage because you have the verminous rule and the choking rule, and you can get around armor, which is sometimes hard for armies that maybe are lower strength, and these guys are lower strength. But for all the damage they can kick out, and as though they're cheap and they have tons of numbers, they have resilience 4 and a low leadership at that.
Yep.
So they are. I think what I'm trying to say is they're a glass-jawed cannon, and I absolutely love that. And I want it's gonna. I'm going to go big or I'm going to go home, and that's fine. And that's, why I play this army, and it's going to be fun.
That's true. The other thing is they're very good at taking out enemy. A lot of people put together an army and they have a very hard character, particularly in the knights list. You make your hero super hard and give him a magic weapon and everything, and he almost wins the game on his own if you're not careful. Well, these guys are very good at taking them out because they've got the choking rule on top of the verminous rule.
That's right.
So, yeah, and you can apply those as because an enemy hero is just on his own anyway. But you can suddenly his armor's not counting for anything, and if you get one hit, you've suddenly got 2 hits. So it becomes quite dangerous.
Yes, very much so. And I am embarrassed to say I have not gotten this on the tabletop yet, but my God, am I looking to do it soon?
Well, I've only done it in a kind of a playtest scenarios. I've not played it in anger, and I don't know anyone who has. So it's very much a first iteration. As we were talking about sculpting earlier, I thought, if I sit down and work out a list and then play test it and spend months and months and get other people involved and get it all really right, it's never going to happen. So what I'll do is I'll put together a list. I'll do some playtesting in solo, invite my mate Nigel to come round and play one game, sort of thing, which is never a great play test of rules, but always good fun.
Exactly. I'm sure Nigel hates. I'm sure Nigel hates it too. Yeah.
Well, he's much more into the historical and
right on.
Amazons and things like that. Yeah. And if it seems to be working, if it's all pretty much as I was expecting, just go with it. And if it needs tinkering with later on, if I get some feedback that goes, no, this glass hammer is too hammery or too glassy, and it might be, I'm not 100%, because you can't test every permutation playing solo. You just don't. It doesn't get you in the same way, where somebody else will see an opportunity you've missed.
Right.
But I thought, get it up there, let people read it and enjoy it, because I've tried to make it entertaining.
Exactly.
And let's see what the feedback's like. Yeah. And then if the feedback is useful, I can make changes. It's very easy for me to do that.
Nice.
I'm quietly confident.
Nice. Well, I mean, again, you've spent time putting together the point system, as we talked about, and you have the basic idea of how the whole mechanics behind the game work, and you followed those mechanics. So it's not like you've gone out in left field and invented something out of nowhere and not, put some actual elbow grease into it. You have, and as the guy who invented the game, it's not like you don't have experience in this. So for us, I mean, it's just a matter of seeing if we can, as we nerds do, we do tend to break or try to break things when we find them. So having that, I think, having nothing like a lot of eager nerds to playtest something to let you know that it doesn't work. And of course, I've been saying nerds a lot, but I do say that as a term of endearment, gang.
Yeah, it's not. It's interesting, isn't it? Over the years and the decades pass, and words slightly change their meaning. And of course, being brought up in England, we now use words like nerd and geek or whatever, which seem very American to me, but they just get used commonly.
Yeah.
We would never have used those when we were 14-year-olds playing war games. Those words didn't exist.
Yeah.
What were we? I don't know. I think we were probably a variety of less pleasant names that I can't repeat.
I got those too. Yep. The joy of well, that's the other thing. I guess mainstream gaming has gaming has become more mainstream. Man, it was
absolutely.
It was punk rock back in the day. Yeah. Oof.
It was it was definitely something that was people would deride the fact that you were playing with toy soldiers. Very much.
Yes, and we'll leave my mother out of this because I'm pretty sure she still does. Anyway. Yeah. Well, okay. You brought up your buddy, and you talked about how he loves historicals. Let's lean a little into Warlords of Erehwon historicals here for a second and get into the Romans. Now, this is a list that I know a lot of people, at least down here in Australia, are super keen exist because they have war bands and armies for other game systems, and this allows them to take some of the fantastic models. I think down here, most of the people I know who have Romans have the Warlord models and are using those to play a game that's put out by Warlord, in this case, you. But I thought that was a nice turn that, they're seeing new life in a new game system, which, as you said before, is what Warlords of Erehwon is all about.
Yeah, well, of course, Warlord themselves have just released SPQR, which is a game with similar objectives.
It is.
But in fact, what happened was that I think Matt Sprang had that game, and he had it ready to go, and he approached Warlord with it. And at the time, Paul Sawyer and John Stallard, they did say to me, well, we'd like to do this game, but if you'd sooner do a historical version of Warlords of Erehwon, well, we could do that instead. And I thought, well, I'd love to do a historical version of Warlords of Erehwon, but the timescale you're talking about, like, a few months, it's just not practical. So, go ahead, do the SPQR because it's all ready to go. Matt Sprang's finished it. It's play tested. It's all good. And I'll just potter along with Warlords of Erehwon and do my thing with it because I don't terribly regard it as a commercial thing. To me, it's just something I'm doing. It's a bit of a hobby. So they did. So they released SPQR, and they've done all of these like little sets for it. They've almost like rebranded their Ancient Range SPQR, which I've not played. I looked through the rules. I did a as part of the Warlord sort of some management team, but part of the Warlord team, exec team. I read through the rules and thought, yeah, these are good to go. I sort of gave them a green light. So they've redone the whole ranges. And a few people have said to me, "Oh, it'd be great if you could play Romans in Warlords of Erehwon, as a fantasy list, really." So I thought, well, it's very easy to do a historical list and add wizards to it, which is essentially what you're. And maybe the heroes become a little bit more heroic than they need be. And I think I added a chariot because chariots or carriages definitely existed in the Roman world. They not really part of an army, but So I just did that, and Romans are my thing. I can do Roman army lists in my sleep, so no worries there. And I've got huge collections of Romans. So I think somebody was saying on Facebook, "Oh, can we see your Roman warband?" And I was thinking, well, I've got. I just pick out the models from my armies that I would need for a warband.
Right.
Most of my Hail Caesar stuff is based up onto multiples, but I've got a lot of Wargames Foundry Romans, some of which are on singles, and I've had some singles done for Erehwon, and actually, and again, going back to my fumblings with toy soldiers. When I made my Celts, my for Wargames Foundry all those years and years ago, I also made a Roman. So,
did you?
He looks a bit. Yeah, he looks a bit like the Romans in Asterix. Asterix, the
yes,
cartoon. Yeah, they're not terribly realistic. Got massive nose, and being Roman, and I don't think they've got the correct number of they're called lames. The segmented armor. I think I just did 5 because they look chunky. So they're a bit they're cartoon Romans really, but I've got some of them. Anyway, I have many Romans. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, I guess, Rick, the question is, though, on all those Romans you have, how many pilums do they have? If I'm reading that right. Pila.
Of each, but on the whole, they've all got one. Yeah, pilum or pila is a plural, I believe. They are. They're just what Romans of the first century. Well, really, first century BC, first century AD, second century AD, going up to about 250. That's your standard That's your Roman, classic Roman kind of image. And they should carry. I can't remember exactly who said it. It was actually it might have been Polybius or Livy, in which case he'd be referencing the Punic Wars, but. They're supposed to have carried 2. Each legionary is supposed to carry 2. One of which was a heavy one might have had a weight on it, and one of which was a lighter one. And I presume they were one thrown and then the other. But I always like to have Roman infantry with a pilum. Some of my Roman infantry have only got swords. Some of the foundry ones have only got swords.
Yeah.
But I always assume they've got some sort of they've got a pilum as well. So same true with Celts. All Celts and Gauls, Britons, and Spanish would tend to have a number of lighter javelins or smaller spear. The distinction between a spear and a javelin is slightly false because the ancient world didn't necessarily use those two words to describe sticks with pointy things on the end.
Oh.
They used a variety of words.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Some of which then confuse people doing research for war games. So a A Roman cavalryman carries a lancia,
Mm-hmm.
which word becomes lance. But really, it's not a lance. It's not a short spear, but it's a spear.
Right.
But it's a spear that would often be thrown at very short range. So over time, the words change their meaning, and you have to be sensitive to that. And I'm plainly not an expert in the language or in the literature of the classical period, but I'm fairly well read.
Yeah.
And I'm well enough read in the principles of archaeology to know that when you're doing research based on literature, you can't take things at face value. So most of that. That's why in Erehwon spears are chuckable. I'm assuming people have got a fairly ordinary common or golden spear and probably another smaller spear. Guys who've only got very light weapons that you would only throw or you would only ever use as a thrusting weapon in emergency.
Right.
Are javelins. And you would get troops like that. Some of the Greek skirmishers, I mean, basically they're out there with a bunch of javelins. And if you find yourself face to face with another enemy in a similar position, you'd take one of your javelins and you'd be using it as to thrust with or to parry with. Either that or you'd throw it and run like mad, I think.
Yeah. Exactly.
But I don't know if you've ever done any sort of reenactment or whatever, but if you've ever done any sort of quarterstaff fighting, a spear isn't just something you thrust or whatever. It's something you can use as to knock over, smash against, and so on. And I think as wargamers, we're very inclined to compartmentalize weapons rather than think in terms of, well, he's got that weapon because culturally that's what they build, but their use can be different in different circumstances. I always used to say when we were doing an online game at one time, when we were planning an online game with Climax, the guys put together a system for combat based on D&D, because that's what most online games do. And in D&D, of course, a sword causes, I think it was D4 damage, and a bigger sword causes D6, and a double-handed sword might be D8 or D12. Yeah. It's something like that. So the amount of damage was caused by the weapon. It didn't really matter who had it. If a halfling had a double-handed weapon, it would cause the same damage as if a great big bloke had it.
Yeah.
And I just thought this was mildly ridiculous, because as far as I was concerned, there's nothing more dangerous than an ogre with a spoon.
Yeah, right.
Because he's going to take that spoon and he's going to cause you some damage.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's generally true of weapons. It doesn't really matter what weapon's been carried. It's much more important who's got it.
Yeah.
I usually apply that principle. So as I say, in Erehwon, I try to make broad distinctions with weapons, and spears are a multiple weapon. But I thought with Romans, I really had to create rules for the pilum because it's such a distinctive weapon.
Yeah.
And it has such a distinctive tactical role. So, as you know, what I did was I said, well, I didn't want it to be a really expensive weapon,
right?
In terms of points value. So I went for no range, but it can only be used for exchange of missiles, which is pretty much how it was used historically. I mean, it did have a range, but it was used primarily at the point of contact.
Right.
And then the first use, it gets SV2. I tried different versions. I tried just making it SV2, just too dangerous. If it's just a one-use SV2, it kind of is okay, because you're going to take a lot of damage the first time you go in, but after that you're down to something that you can tolerate.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I tried 5-inch range with the same split SV. And the problem with that was that at 5 inches you never throw anything. It's just too short.
Yeah, you got to charge.
And also at 5 inches, is it half a point? Or is it 1 point? Or is it no points? If it's no points, it seems like you're making it too good, and if it's
Yeah.
1 point is too. So in the end, I thought let's just try it as a simple exchange weapon, and actually, I thought that worked a lot better. People will have to let me know what they think, because again, sometimes you try these things and it seems okay in the context of your own games.
Yeah.
And other people struggle, but I thought it did. I thought it did the job.
Now, with the Roman list in general, do you think, as a man with a large collection of Roman models, do you think that your list is, of course, I'm asking the guy who wrote it, so I know you may be a little biased here. However,
it's perfect in every way.
Yeah, there you go. Do you think that the list, there really are a lot of unit type options in the list. Is it as inclusive as you'd like? Or do you think you might expand it in the future, given that that's one of those... it's sort of, I don't want to say a genre, but an army list type that could be very wide spanning.
Well, I included every historical troop type that I could think of.
Yeah. And I am not an expert, by the way, which is why I was asking. Sorry.
Oh, no. Well, I say I'm not an expert. I'm pretty well read, because it's something I've always been interested in.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm pretty well read upon that. And in terms of books on armor and Roman armor and Roman, I do keep up. Mostly the things which have been, let's say, you wouldn't necessarily expect. Some of the discoveries about horse armor, and there are cataphract units and clipinari units in the Roman army from the about first century, certainly second century onwards, where you've got the more heavily armored cavalry types. They're not as heavily armored as they became. The Roman army became much more of a mounted force after the 3rd century. When you get the 3rd century collapse around the middle of the 3rd century, basically the Roman Empire it collapsed, and the old Roman Empire that's in your head, because you've seen the movie, and everybody knows and understands, that really comes to an end. And many people now think of the medieval period as starting from the end of the 3rd century. Because the later Roman Empire, when it was reconstituted, had a lot more in common with the later early Middle Ages than it did with the preceding classical period. And there's lots of reasons for that. Some of them are massively demographic, because there was a series of plagues that wiped out populations. If you look at the size of the armies and the populations in the Punic period, they're huge armies. They're vast, and Rome becomes a city of millions of people, and the whole of Italy is very heavily populated, and North Africa as well. And then from the 3rd century, you get the Justinian plagues and things like that. You enter a period where I think human populations have just generally across the world become quite large, and they'd sustained some heavy plagues and diseases, and they were starting to become massive global affairs, and human populations were just devastated, and it really affected the economies and the military base for these civilizations. And you get the rise of cavalry in particular, because they're mobile and can move easily to different places. The old scholars like the Euroman would typically put this down to the rise of the cavalryman and the discovery of spurs and charging with the lance and spurs, and that's not reckoned to be. That's people looking at material things and ascribing. It's just that typical way of people think of those things. But the reality was that spurs had been used, for example, for ever since horse riding started, really. In some small way. It's just the Roman cavalry didn't use them. They generally, the early Roman cavalry, they generally steered with the knees, as did Greeks. You get that difference. Anyway, so my list really covers up to that period. It covers, say, the 1st century AD, the rise of the classic Roman legion from the time of Marius, through the Civil Wars, rise of Augustus, and that's Principate, and then the early Imperial period. First century AD, second century AD, you've got the Dacian Wars, and then roughly the first half of the third century AD, if you like. But I tend to think of the first and second century AD as being the time up to the end of the. You can kind of go up to the end of the reign of Marcus Aurelius, if you like. That's the. After that, it starts to go downhill.
Yeah, well, there you go.
So
End of the Roman
that's
Empire.
What I know about Rome.
Wow, clearly you know a little bit about the Roman Empire, Rick. Well, okay.
Well,
so
no more than most people who are sort of interested in that kind of thing. You know?
Exactly. Exactly. Well, let's talk a little bit about this then. Between the core game and list that you put out later, we have the Knights list, we have the Romans, we have the Samurai, we have the Olympians. And if you look, I mean, even the Barbarians, if you want to, I faced off against a friend's Celtic chariot army and dog army a while back, which he made for another game system and was not historically based whatsoever, but he did use Warlords Celt models to make that army. And he, when we played, used the barbarian rules. Now, maybe you're not using every single barbarian. I did see you suggest using barbarians at one point for someone who asked about using Celts online, and you went, "Oh, use barbarians," and he went, "Well, a lot of the entries don't match." And you say, "Well, don't use them.
Don't use those entries."
Yeah, exactly. Ta-da! Look at that. Make a themed list. But do you anticipate going down the historical path further? I guess I'm asking from where now? Are we going? Do you have any new lists up your sleeve? Do you have historical leanings? Are you going to want to do more spells, new magic items? What are you thinking, Rick?
Yeah, I've not really thought about spells and magic because I didn't want the game to become a game of spells and magic. And I think the spells I did were enough. And in fact, we had to tidy a couple of those up a little bit because they were proving to be too dangerous. But I immediately, I think the thing people have asked for, which I'd quite like to expand into, is the chaos and the demon element. But I've got some ideas for that, but I've not really, I've not given it a serious go. That's probably, which I shall have to do, if only for my own satisfaction. Then there's a few other things which I'd quite like to have a go at, which are slightly more wild, like the kind of Melnibonian, the Michael Moorcock kind of a dragon riders army and things like that.
Oh, hello!
Quite entertaining.
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be quite fun.
Yes.
Might not work at small sizes, but I've always wanted to do a Dragon Riders army. And in fact, years and years ago, when I was at Citadel, I picked up a whole batch of Ralparth the Dragon Riders, which have sat in my garage ever since. Not painted, not they're still in their packets, in fact. And I think there must be at least a half a dozen. And they're a nice size. They're not like the modern Games Workshop dragons or some of the people make a dragon and they make it. How enormous my dragon is! Yeah, well, it's too big to play a game with, isn't it?
Yes.
These are about maybe 5 or 6 inches long.
That's a good size for tabletop.
A nice. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and as I said, I picked up a nice minifigs dragon from their Valley of the Four Winds range recently too, which I've put together and undercoated and based, and I'm sat there looking at it thinking, I don't know what colour to paint this. The indecision has got me.
I hear you.
But it's a nice model. Yeah,
it does strike sometimes model. that it just gets you. That just the indecision. Do I paint it this color? Do I paint it that color? I've been staring at a couple models myself. Some days you just got to get in there though, and usually I find when I'm tired, I'm just like, oh, forget it. I'll paint it this color. And then I'm never disappointed. But it's always that ooh before I start that gets me every time and keeps me from putting paint on model.
Right. Oh, well, that's where I am. You described it perfectly. So there's that. But I've also been asked, will you do more historical lists? And I think my reply was along the line on Facebook. I think my reply was along the lines of, "Well, it's very easy because you just basically take a barbarian list and you miss out all the things you don't need." So if people want one, I'll certainly put something together. I can do a Celt list because there is a Celt list within the barbarian list.
There
really.
is.
Yeah, I mean, I might be able to just do a little bit more with it. And really, Celt is an odd one because there's no such thing as Celt.
Right.
It's a modern construct. So really, what you're talking about is perhaps a Gaelic list.
Yes.
And again, there's Gaul and there's Gaul. It's not absolutely certain even that the Gauls spoke the same language across the whole of that the whole of what is now France and parts of Germany and Italy. That some of the tribes that ran across the border are described variously as Germans or Gauls by Caesar. And there's so it's a little bit of a mix. And the Britons on the other side of the Channel, well, Caesar says that the Britons spoke the same language as the Gauls on the other side of the Channel, but he never says what that language is. So we tend to assume that they spoke Celtic, a Celtic language, and only a Celtic language. But it has been hypothesized that right from a very early period, there were people in what is now Britain, the island, who spoke a Germanic language. It's not impossible. Though I tend to think that's fallen out of favor a little bit more recently.
Well, my Scottish father-in-law does love to talk about whenever we watch a movie or a television show, and he loves to watch a historical-based television show and then point out, that language isn't right. And you're like, wait, 2 weeks ago you told me it was a different language. Wait a minute. And you get the feeling that he's constantly reading up on these things and wants to show that. And you go, yes.
Well, yeah. Well, Scots. I can never remember which one's Gaelic and which one's Gaelic. I think it's Gaelic in Scotland. I mean, the Scottish Celtic language and the Irish Celtic language are related,
right?
But not the same.
No, they are different.
And even in Ireland, there are, I think, at least 3 main dialects. Although, and the Welsh is different. Again, it's fundamentally different. It's is it P Celtic as opposed to Q Celtic?
No idea.
So it's just different further back. Yeah. And the same as Breton. Breton is very similar to Welsh.
Yeah.
So but anyway, it's not really about the language. It's just I was just saying that people ask for a Celt army list. I'm going, well, you can have a Briton army list. I can base it on that, or I can do a Gaelic army list, but it would be based on perhaps the forces that fought against Caesar.
Exactly.
Which wouldn't necessarily include chariots, for example. And the chariot warfare was something which disappeared on the continent a long time before it disappeared in the British Isles and Ireland. And again, you can do an Irish list based on the. Again, you be careful because if you're basing it on the Irish the Irish legend cycles, you're really basing it on a mythical background. But of course, it references a historical reality.
Yep.
And so you have chariots in Ireland even before the Romans may have been in Ireland. It's something which became politically very sensitive in Ireland because. They always had this Irish nationalists always had this kind of proud, never conquered by the Romans thing going on. And then they discovered what could have been a Roman trading colony near Dublin. It's just north of Dublin, if I remember right. And this caused a lot of unnecessary, in my view, angst and argument. But it's not impossible that the Romans did mount military expeditions either in support of a local chieftain or to protect their trading interests. Not impossible. With the Irish raiding into Britain and so on and so forth. So there's the potential to do army lists for all of those things. So I will do, Brad.
Nice. Oh, I love it. Now, Rick, I mean, this is possibly our longest chat yet, and we could keep going probably for days. Thank you for coming on to Cast Ice. It is always a pleasure, and if we stop here, then perhaps soon we can have you back, because it is always a pleasure to talk shop, and every single time you come on, there's just some great anecdotes, and I learned something new about you and gaming in general. And this is a subject that I like to think I know a lot about. And every time you'd say things, and I triple take at least 3 times every single time we talk. So it has been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you, as always, for making the time. It is an honor. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Brad. Cheerio.
Cheerio, right on. And ladies and gentlemen at home, thank you for listening. It is always lovely to have you listening. This is the second year of Cast Ice, and Rick coming on is the second part of our official second birthday party celebration. We will return to normal, regular, quote-unquote, Cast Ice coverage, which is... all sorts of things, namely like this, talking about the games that we know and love, resuming next week. I am looking forward to playing Warlords of Erehwon very soon on our YouTube channel. In fact, we did have a game that was scheduled a couple weeks ago, and unfortunately I got ill. But as a result, it now looks like I will be playing my Ratters the next time that I record, or perhaps one of my others. I'm not sure, but I'm looking forward to playing WoW, as we call it sometimes, online, so you can see the game played out in full as we play it here in Melbourne, which I hope is the right way when Rick watches it. Hi, Rick. Anyway, on that note, as our good buddy Casey always says, when you are playing these games that we know and love, we hope that your dice roll hot. We hope that your beverages are cold. But more than anything else, we hope that you're having fun and that you are well. This is Cast Ice saying good night.
Another day rising, Paraguayan sun, through the cracks open, another Heineken. He's all alone, he's in his little room, he's all alone, with a Burmese python and a chase is on. In his dreams